Okay, here we are in the Gilded Age, which is the late part of the 1800s, so last half of the 1800s, I guess. And this is the starting date here I would have is the Bessemer Process, which happened sometime in the 1850s. And this was the process for making steel, so it was affordable, so industries could use more of the steel. So in things like building the railroads themselves, the railroad tracks, as well as the engines for the trains. Also, buildings, the support for buildings, like the inside of the building, so they could build up taller buildings. So steel became widely available as a result of this Bessemer process. And that really kind of kicks off industrialization. I have the ending date is the 1890s here, even though this isn't mentioned in chapter 17 of your Brinkley textbook, but this is kind of a reaction to some of the business practices that were happening during the Gilded Age. So the Antitrust Movement was trying to kind of the first attempts by government and other people to try and regulate what they saw as unfair business practices, because they felt like the way the businesses were operating with the laissez-faire philosophy was unfair to kind of regular people. Now, you could have also used, there's a economic panic in 1893 that the economy kind of drops off pretty significantly, and that again also kind of hurts regular people, and they feel like one of the reasons for that is kind of how big business has become so dominant. All right, so we're going to go through some of these practices here to kind of understand how things were changing. We talked about the Bessemer process a little bit here. The Bessemer process was the first kind of cheap and efficient way to make steel. It's going to be replaced by something called the open hearth process a bit later on, but it did allow for more steel production. And so Pittsburgh in western Pennsylvania was kind of the center of that steel production. People like Andrew Carnegie, that's where they would have a lot of their steel plants. Around the same time, you have oil starts to be used industrially, mostly for lubrication to ease friction and that sort of thing in machines. It's not really used for gasoline until later. They actually throw gasoline out because they feel like it's a waste product from the oil that they're refining for lubrication and stuff. And the first oil wells in western Pennsylvania. So again, notice how Pennsylvania, both Pittsburgh and western Pennsylvania here, are kind of centers for these new industrial processes. So like Pennsylvania, Ohio, these kind of like Midwestern areas are going to be important for this industrialization. One of the other key things is how companies were organized. It used to be that when you had a business, like as an owner, you were called a sole proprietor. That means that you were all your money was at risk. If you went into debt as a business owner, you were personally responsible for that. With a limited liability corporation, they don't have that anymore. You only are risking what you invest. So like you have several investors that would put money into a company, and you only risk, the worst that could happen is you could lose all of that money. You wouldn't be on the hook for your money you have outside of that. So if you have, $1,000 in the bank and you take $100 to invest in a company, you're only risking that $100, not the whole 1,000 that you have. So this allowed stock to be sold publicly so that they could raise money for new projects that were more expensive than any one person could have. And so this allows companies to grow pretty substantially. So around the same time as the Bessemer process oil, you have the railroad expansion. So this is like kind of actual industrial stuff. So railroad tracks really exploded from 1860 to 1900. You can see they went from 30,000 miles in 1860 to 193,000 in 1900. So that was partly due to the cheap availability of steel. And so railroads were used as the main method of transportation in the country. So lumber from forests in the west, cattle, once the cattle drives ended like in Abilene, Texas, and those kinds of places. And then the cattle would be shipped by train to Chicago. You have farms that were shipping their goods along the railroad tracks as well. And so the railroad tracks were kind of like modern highways. When a highway is built, that means railroads are built, that means that towns would grow near those tracks. Think about the movie Cars, for example, where Radiator Springs kind of dies off because the highway was built off to the side, and Radiator Springs originally came popular because the road went through there. Same idea with railroad tracks. Also, the impact of railroad tracks on the country, like time zones, were created to standardize time for the railroads to make sure they could know when trains were arriving and leaving and coordinate the tracks and stuff. And those are dominated by people like Cornelius Vanderbilt and Collis Huntington. So these railroad expansions were dominated by a few figures. We also have, besides the industrial stuff, there's stuff that deals with workers too. So Taylorism here is like the dividing of tasks into smaller tasks, right, to make it more efficient. It's called scientific management. It kind of it kind of led to the assembly line, reduced the need for skilled workers. I don't know why I don't have that there, but it reduced the need for skilled workers. So you can put anybody in those positions. Their job is to put in this screw or whatever it is, right? All right, so aside from industrial practices and practices to make working more efficient, there are some ways in which business was practiced as well. So corporate research, companies are hiring scientists and engineers to research things to make new products. And this is kind of a first. And then universities, where most research had been done, was started to be funded by companies. So you can maybe start to see how business is going to influence areas beyond the business into education and stuff. So universities might become dependent on money from companies, for example, and therefore might be pressured to do research that benefits the companies. So you can kind of see how the companies would gain a little bit of power there. All right, so we also have two ways of organizing kind of like practicing your business: horizontal integration and vertical integration. This is about eliminating competition and lowering prices and controlling an industry. Horizontal integration was basically buying or bankrupting your competitors, so that if you sold, if you sold lemonade, you would make sure that all your lemonade competitors would be out of business. You would buy them up, or you would lower prices so they would go bankrupt, and then you would control the entire industry. The other is vertical integration. So this is where you can control all parts of the process. So again, if you're selling like lemonade, that means that you own the land where the lemon trees were grown. You own the sugar fields where the sugar cane is grown. So then you can put that all together into the lemonade yourself, transport it, and then sell it. So you control all parts. That means you can sell things for lower prices because you don't have to pay markups at each step. You're not buying lemons from somebody else. You're not buying sugar from somebody else. So Carnegie was kind of the main practicer of vertical integration, or the most well-known practicer of vertical integration. Both of these allowed you to control an industry, to keep prices low, or to actually fix prices however you wanted, and you could have what's called a monopoly or complete control. Our last one are trust agreements. Trust agreements are a way to kind of take multiple companies and combine them into one larger kind of trust, right? So what happened is an individual stockholder would give ownership of their company to a trust, and that trust would then give back shares to the stockholders in the trust. So that way you could have multiple companies giving their shares to the trust, and that trust giving shares in the trust to the stockholders. So you have like maybe 5 different companies all in one trust. And they combined multiple companies together into one kind of trust, and that was controlled by a few trustees. So you had these very large kind of combinations. All right, so at the time of these new industrial practices and techniques, there were some contradictory characteristics as well. So there were some scientists that criticized this commercialization of the corporate research of knowledge. They felt like knowledge should be pursued for its own sake, not for how much money you could make off of it. And also, laissez-faire, which is government, which is kind of like free market idea, that the market should be allowed to act however they want and not have anybody interfere with that. What's interesting here is what role the government provided in the railroad industry in particular. The governments funded the railroads to some degree. They gave really cheap land to the railroad companies so they could build the railroads, lots of incentives. So there was actually quite a bit of government involvement when it comes to the railroad building. So it kind of goes against this idea of laissez-faire and letting businesses kind of do whatever they want.